Farmers of 40 Centuries. Preface by Dr. L. H. Bailey. We have not yet gathered up the experience of mankind in the tilling of the earth, yet the tilling of the earth is the bottom condition of civilization. If we are to assemble all the forces and agencies that make for the final conquest of the planet, we must assuredly know how it is that all the peoples in all places have met the problem of producing their sustenance out of the soil. We have had few great agricultural travelers and few books that describe the real and significant rural conditions. Of natural history travel we have had very much, and of accounts of sites and events perhaps we have had too many. There are, to be sure, famous books of study and travel in rural regions, and some of them, as Arthur Young's Travels in France, have touched social and political history, but for the most part, authorship of agricultural travel is yet undeveloped. The spirit of scientific inquiry must now be taken into this field, and all earth conquest must be compared and the results given to the people that work. This was the point of view from which I read Professor King's manuscript. It is the writing of a well-trained observer who went forth not to find diversion or to depict scenery and common wonders, but to study the actual conditions of life of agricultural peoples. We in North America are wont to think that we may instruct all the world in agriculture, because our agricultural wealth is great and our exports to less favored peoples have been heavy. But this wealth is great because our soil is fertile and new, and in large acreage for every person. We have really only begun to farm well. The first condition of farming is to maintain fertility. This condition the Oriental peoples have met, and they have solved it in their way. We may never adopt particular methods, but we can profit vastly by their experience. With the increase of personal wants in recent time, the newer countries may never reach such density of population as have Japan and China, but we must nevertheless learn the first lesson in the conservation of natural resources, which are the resources of the land. This is the message that Professor King brought home from the East. This book on agriculture should have good effect in establishing understanding between the West and the East. If there could be such an interchange of courtesies and inquiries on these themes as is suggested by Professor King, as well as the interchange of athletics and diplomacy and commerce, the common productive people on both sides should gain much that they could use, and the results in amity should be incalculable. It is a misfortune that Professor King could not have lived to write the concluding message of China and Japan to the world. It would have been a careful and forceful summary of his study of Eastern conditions. At the moment when the work was going to the printer, he was called suddenly to the endless journey and his travel here was left incomplete. But he bequeathed us a new piece of literature, to add to his standard writings on soils and on the applications of physics and devices to agriculture. Whatever he touched he illuminated. L. H. Bailey. Introduction. A word of introduction is needed to place the reader at the best viewpoint from which to consider what is said in the following pages regarding the agricultural practices and customs of China, Korea and Japan. It should be borne in mind that the great factors which today characterize and determine the agricultural and other industrial operations of Western nations were physical impossibilities to them as to all other peoples 100 years ago, and until then had been so to all people. It should be observed, too, that the United States as yet is a nation of but few people widely scattered over a broad virgin land with more than 20 acres to the support of every man, woman and child, while the people whose practices are to be considered are toiling in fields which have been tilled for more than 3,000 years and who have scarcely more than 2 acres per capita, more than 1/2 of which is uncultivable mountain land. Again, the great movement of cargoes of feeding stuffs and mineral fertilizers to Western Europe and to the eastern United States began less than a century ago and has never been possible as a means of maintaining soil fertility in China, Korea or Japan, nor can it be continued indefinitely in either Europe or America. These importations are for the time making tolerable the waste of plant food materials through our modern systems of sewage disposal and other faulty practices, but the Mongolian races have held all such wastes, both urban and rural, and many others which we ignore, sacred to agriculture, applying them to their fields. We are to consider some of the practices of a virile race of some 500 millions of people who have an unimpaired inheritance moving with the momentum acquired through 4,000 years, a people morally and intellectually strong, mechanically capable, who are awakening to a utilization of all the possibilities which science and invention during recent years have brought to Western nations, and a people who have long dearly loved peace but who can and will fight in self-defense if compelled to do so. We had long desired to stand face to face with Chinese and Japanese farmers, the oldest farmers in the world, to walk through their fields and to learn by seeing some of their methods, appliances and practices which centuries of stress and experience have led them to adopt. We desired to learn how it is possible, after 20 and perhaps 30 or even 40 centuries, for their soils to be made to produce sufficiently for the maintenance of such dense populations as are living now in these 3 countries. We have now had this opportunity, and almost every day we were instructed in the ways and extent to which these nations for centuries have been conserving and utilizing their natural resources. We were surprised at the magnitude of the returns they are getting from their fields, and amazed at the amount of efficient human labor cheerfully given for a daily wage of 5 cents in their food, or for 15 cents, United States currency. Without food, the three main islands of Japan in 1907 had a population of 46,977,003 maintained on 20,000 square miles of cultivated field. This is at the rate of more than 3 people to each acre, and of 2,349 to each square mile, and yet the total agricultural imports into Japan in 1907 exceeded the agricultural exports by less than $1 per capita. If the cultivated land of Holland is estimated at but 1/3 of her total area, the density of her population in 1905 was, on this basis, less than 1/3 that of Japan in her three main islands. At the same time, Japan is feeding 69 horses and 56 cattle, nearly all laboring animals, to each square mile of cultivated field, while in the same area on an average we in the United States were feeding in 1900 not more than 30 horses and mules. Are laboring animals. As coarse food transformers, Japan was maintaining 16,500,000 domestic fowl, 825 per square mile, but only one for almost 3 of her people. We were maintaining, in 1900, 250,600,000 poultry, but only 387 per square mile of cultivated field, and yet more than 3 for each person. Japan's coarse food transformers in the form of swine, goats and sheep aggregated but 13 to the square mile and provided but one of these units for each 180 of her people, while in the United States in 1900 there were being maintained, as transformers of grass and coarse grain into meat and milk, 95 cattle, 99 sheep and 72 swine per each square mile of improved farms. In this reckoning, each of the cattle should be counted as the equivalent of perhaps 5 of the sheep and swine, for the transforming power of the dairy cow is high. On this basis we are maintaining at the rate of more than 646 of the Japanese units per square mile, and more than 5 of these to every man, woman and child, instead of 1 to every 180 of the population, as is the case in Japan. Correspondingly accurate statistics are not accessible for China, but in the Shantung province we talked with a farmer having 12 in his family who kept 1 donkey, 1 cow, both exclusively laboring animals, and 2 pigs on 5 acres of cultivated land where he grew wheat, millet, sweet potatoes and beans. Here is a density of population equal to 3,072 people, 256 donkeys, 256 cattle and 512 swine per square mile. In another instance where the holding was 1 2/3 acres, the farmer had 10 in his family and was maintaining 1 donkey and 1 pig, showing for this farmland a maintenance capacity of 3,840 people. 384 donkeys and 384 pigs to the square mile, or 240 people, 24 donkeys and 24 pigs to one of our 40-acre farms, which our farmers regard too small for a single family. The average of 7 Chinese holdings which we visited and where we obtained similar data indicates a maintenance capacity of 1,783 people, 212 cattle or donkeys and 399 swine minus 995 consumers and 399 rough food transformers per square mile of farmland. These statements for China represent strictly rural populations. The rural population of the United States in 1900 was placed at 61 per square mile of improved farmland, and there were 30 horses and mules. In Japan, the rural population had a density in 1907 of 1,922 per square mile, and in addition there were 125 horses and cattle. The population of the large island of Chunming in the mouth of the Yangtze River, with an area of 270 square miles, possessed, according to the official census of 1902, a density of 3,700 per square mile, and yet, as there is but one large city on the island, the population is largely rural. It could not be other than a matter of the highest industrial, educational and social importance to any nation if it could be furnished with a full and accurate account of all those conditions which have made it possible for such dense populations to be maintained upon the products of Chinese, Korean and Japanese soils. Many of the steps, phases and practices through which this evolution has passed are irrevocably buried in the past. But such remarkable maintenance efficiency attained centuries ago and projected into the present with little apparent decadence merits the most profound study. Living as we are in the morning of a century of transition from isolated to cosmopolitan national life, when profound readjustments, industrial, educational and social, must result, such an investigation cannot be made too soon. It is high time for each nation to study other nations and, by mutual agreement and cooperative effort, the results of such studies should be made available for the rest, so that all may become co-ordinate and mutually helpful component factors in the world's progress. One very appropriate and immensely helpful means for attacking this problem would be for the higher educational institutions of all nations, instead of exchanging courtesies through their baseball teams, to send select bodies of their best students, under competent leadership and by international agreement, both East and West, to study specific problems. Such a movement, well conceived and directed, manned by the most capable young men, would spread broadcast a body of important knowledge which would contribute immensely to world peace and world progress. If some broad plan of international effort such as is here suggested were organized, the expense of maintenance might well be met by diverting so much as is needful from the large sum set aside for the expansion of navies, for such steps as these, taken in the interests of world uplift and world peace, could not fail to be more efficacious and less expensive than increase in fighting equipment. It would cultivate the spirit of pulling together an ill of a secure deal rather than one of holding aloof and of striving to gain unneighborly advantage. Many factors and conditions conspire to give to the farms and farmers of the Far East their high maintenance efficiency, and some of these may be succinctly stated. The portions of China, Korea and Japan, where dense populations have developed and are being maintained, occupy exceptionally favorable geographic positions so far as these influence agricultural production. Canton in the south of China has the latitude of Havana, Cuba, while Mukden in Manchuria, and northern Honshu in Japan, are only as far north as New York City, Chicago and northern California. The United States lies mainly between 50 degrees and 30 degrees of latitude, while these three countries lie between 40 degrees and 20 degrees, some 700 miles further south. This difference of position, giving them longer seasons, has made it possible for them to devise systems of agriculture whereby they grow 2, 3 and even 4 crops on the same piece of ground each year. In southern China, in Formosa and in parts of Japan 2 crops of rice are grown. In the Zhejiang province there may be a crop of rape, of wheat or barley or of Windsor beans or clover which is followed in midsummer by another of cotton or of rice. In the Shantung province wheat or barley in the winter and spring may be followed in summer by large or small millet, sweet potatoes, soybeans or peanuts. At Tientsin, 39 degrees north, in the latitude of Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Springfield, Illinois, we talked with a farmer who followed his crop of wheat on his small holding with one of onions and the onions with cabbage, realizing from the 3 crops at the rate of $163 gold per acre, and with another who planted Irish potatoes at the earliest opportunity in the spring, marketing them when small, then followed these with radishes, and the radishes with cabbage, realizing from the 3 crops at the rate of $203 per acre. Nearly 500 million people are being maintained, chiefly upon the products of an area smaller than the improved farmlands of the United States. Complete a square on the lines drawn from Chicago southward to the Gulf and westward across Kansas, and there will be enclosed an area greater than the cultivated fields of China, Korea and Japan, from which 5 times our present population are fed. The rainfall in these countries is not only larger than that even in our Atlantic and Gulf states, but it falls more exclusively during the summer season when its efficiency in crop production may be highest. South China has a rainfall of some 80 inches with little of it during the winter, while in our southern states the rainfall is nearer 60 inches with less than 1/2 of it between June and September. Along a line drawn from Lake Superior through central Texas the yearly precipitation is about 30 inches, but only 16 inches of this falls during the months of May to September, while in the Shantung province, China, with an annual rainfall of little more than 24 inches, 17 of these fall during the months designated and most of this in July and August. When it is stated that under the best tillage and with no loss of water through percolation, most of our agricultural crops require 300 to 600 tons of water for each ton of dry substance brought to maturity, it can be readily understood that the right amount of available moisture, coming at the proper time, must be one of the prime factors of a high maintenance capacity for any soil, and hence that in the Far East, with their intensive methods, it is possible to make their soils yield large returns. The selection of rice and of the millets as the great staple food crops of the 3 nations specified, and the systems of agriculture they have evolved so as to realize the largest possible yield from them, are to us remarkable, and indicate a grasp of essential principles which may well cause Western nations to pause and reflect. Notwithstanding the large and favorable rainfall of these countries, the people have in each case selected the one crop which permits them to utilize not only practically the entire amount of rain which falls upon their fields, but in addition enormous volumes of the runoff from adjacent uncultivable mountain coinetry. Wherever paddy fields are practicable there rice is grown. In the 3 main islands of Japan 56% of the cultivated fields, 11,000 square miles, is laid out for rice growing and is maintained under water from transplanting to near harvest time, after which the land is allowed to dry, to be devoted to dry land crops during the balance of the year, where the season permits. To anyone who studies the agricultural methods of the Far East in the field it is evident that these people, centuries ago, came to appreciate the value of water in crop production as no other nations have. They have adapted conditions to crops and crops to conditions to such a pitch that in rice they have produced a cereal which permits the most intense fertilization and at the same time ensures the maximum yields against both drought and flood. With the practice of Western nations in all humid climates, no matter how completely and highly we fertilize, in more years than not, yields are reduced by a deficiency or an excess of water. It is difficult to convey, by word or map, an adequate conception of the magnitude of the systems of canalization which contribute primarily to rice culture. A conservative estimate would place the miles of canals in China at fully 200,000, and there are probably more miles of canal in China, Korea and Japan than there are miles of railroad in the United States. China alone has as many acres in rice each year as the United States has in wheat, and her annual product is more than double and probably threefold our annual wheat crop. And yet the whole of the rice area produces at least one and sometimes two other crops each year. The selection of the quick-maturing, drought-resisting millets as the great staple food crops to be grown wherever water is not available for irrigation, and the almost universal planting in hills or drills, and so making possible the utilization of earth mulches and conserving soil moisture, has enabled these people for centuries past to secure maximum returns in seasons of drought and in places where the rainfall is small. The millets thrive in the hot summer climates, they survive when the available soil moisture is reduced to a low limit, and they grow vigorously when the heavy rains come. Thus we find that in the Far East, with more rainfall and a better distribution of it than occurs in the United States, and with warmer, longer seasons, these people have with rare wisdom combined both irrigation and dry farming methods to an extent and with an intensity far beyond anything our people have ever dreamed of, in order that they might maintain these dense populations. Notwithstanding the fact that in each of these countries the soils are naturally more than ordinarily deep, inherently fertile and enduring, judicious and rational methods of fertilization are everywhere practiced, but not until recent years, and only in Japan, have mineral commercial fertilizers been used. For centuries, however, the canals, streams and the sea have been made to contribute toward the fertilization of cultivated fields, and these contributions in the aggregate have been large. In China, in Korea and in Japan all but the inaccessible portions of their vast extent of mountain and hill lands have long been taxed to their full capacity for fuel, timber, and herbage, for green manure and compost material. And the ash of practically all the fuel and of all the timber used in the home finds its way ultimately to the fields as fertilizer. In China enormous quantities of canal mud are applied to the fields, sometimes at the rate of even 70 and more tons per acre. So, too, where there are no canals, both soil and subsoil are carried into the villages and there they are, at the expense of great labor, composted with organic refuse, then dried and pulverized, and finally carried back to the fields to be used as homemade fertilizers. Manure of all kinds, human and animal, is religiously saved and applied to the fields in a manner which secures an efficiency far above our own practices. Statistics obtained through the Bureau of Agriculture, Japan, placed the amount of human waste in that country in 1908 at 23,950,295 tons, or 175 tons per acre of her cultivated land. The international concession of the city of Shanghai, in 1908, sold to a Chinese contractor the privilege of entering residences and public places early in the morning of each day in the year and removing the night soil, at a price of more than $31,000 gold, for 78,000 tons of waste. All of this we not only throw away but expend much larger sums in doing so. Japan's production of fertilizing material, regularly prepared and applied to the land annually, amounts to more than 4-5 tons per acre of cultivated field exclusive of the commercial fertilizers purchased. Between Shanhaikwan and Mukden in Manchuria we passed, on June 18, thousands of tons of the dry highly nitrified compost soil recently carried into the fields and laid down in piles where it was waiting to be fed to the crops. It was not until 1888, and then after a prolonged war of more than 30 years, generated by the best scientists of all Europe, that it was finally conceded as demonstrated that leguminous plants acting as hosts for lower organisms living on their roots are largely responsible for the maintenance of soil nitrogen, drawing it directly from the air to which it is returned through the processes of decay. But centuries of practice had taught the Far East farmers that the culture and use of these crops are essential to enduring fertility. And so in each of the 3 countries with which we are dealing the extensive growing of legumes in rotation with other crops, for the express purpose of fertilizing the soil, is one of their old, fixed practices. Just before, or immediately after, the rice crop is harvested, fields are often sowed to clover, Astragalus sinicus, which is allowed to grow until near the next transplanting time when it is either turned under directly, or more often stacked along the canals and saturated with soft mud dipped from the bottom of the canal. After fermenting 20 or 30 days it is applied to the field. And so it is literally true that these old world farmers whom we regard as ignorant, perhaps because they do not ride sulky plows as we do, have long included legumes in their crop rotation, regarding them as indispensable. Time is a function of every life process as it is of every physical, chemical and mental reaction. The husbandman is an industrial biologist and as such is compelled to shape his operations so as to conform with the time requirements of his crops. The Oriental farmer is a time economizer beyond all others. He utilizes the first and last minute and all that are between. The foreigner speaks of the Chinese as people who always take their time, are never in a fret, and never in a hurry. This is quite true, and they are so for the reason that they are a people who definitely set their faces toward the future and lead time by the forelock. They have long realized that much time is required to transform organic matter into forms available for plant food, and, although they are the heaviest users in the world, the largest portion of this organic matter is predigested with soil or subsoil before it is applied to their fields. This is at an enormous cost of human time and labor, but it practically lengthens their growing season and enables them to adopt a system of multiple cropping which would not otherwise be possible. By planting in hills and rows with intertillage, it is very common to see 3 crops growing upon the same field at one time, but in different stages of maturity, one nearly ready to harvest, one just coming up, and the third at the stage when it is drawing most heavily upon the soil. By such practice, with heavy fertilization supplemented by irrigation when needful, the soil is made to do full duty throughout the growing season. Then, notwithstanding the enormous acreage of rice planted each year, it is all in the first instance set in hills and later transplanted. By this method, the farmer saves in all ways, with the single exception of human labor, which is the one thing they have in excess. By thoroughly preparing the seedbed, fertilizing highly and giving the most careful attention, he is able to grow on 1 acre, during 30 to 50 days, enough plants to occupy 10 acres, and in the meantime on the remaining 9 acres other crops are maturing. After these are harvested, the fields are prepared to receive the rice, which by this time is ready for transplanting, so that in effect this interval of time is added to the growing season of the rice crops. Silk culture is a great and, in some ways, one of the most remarkable industries of the Orient. Remarkable for its magnitude, for having had its birthplace apparently in oldest China at least 2,700 years BC, for having grown out of the domestication of a wild insect of the woods, and for having lived through more than 4,000 years, expanding to such an extent that now as much as $1 million cargo of the product has been laid down on our western coast and rushed by special fast express to the east for the Christmas trade. A low estimate of China's production of raw silk would be 120 million pounds annually, and this with the output of Japan, Korea and a small area of southern Manchuria, would probably exceed 150 million pounds annually, representing a total value of perhaps section 700 million, equaling in value the wheat crop of the United States, but produced on less than 1/8 the area of our wheat fields. The cultivation of tea in China and Japan is another of the great industries of these nations, taking rank with that of sericulture, if not above it, in the important part it plays in the welfare of the people. There is little reason to doubt that this industry has its foundation in the need of something to render boiled water palatable for drinking purposes. The drinking of boiled water is universally adopted in these countries as an individually available and thoroughly efficient safeguard against that class of deadly disease germs which so far it has been impossible to exclude from the drinking water. In its natural state of any densely peopled country, judged by the success of the most thorough sanitary measures instituted up till now, and taking into consideration inherent difficulties which must increase enormously with increasing populations, it appears inevitable that modern methods must ultimately fail in sanitary efficiency and that absolute safety can be secured only in some manner having the equivalent effect of boiling drinking water, long ago adopted by the Mongolian races. In the year 1907, Japan had 124,482 acres of land and tea plantations, producing 60,877,975 pounds of cured tea. In China, the volume annually produced is much larger than that of Japan, 40 million pounds going annually to Tibet alone from the Sichuan province. The direct export to foreign countries was, in 1905, 170,027,255 pounds, and in 190G it was 180,271,000, so that their annual export must exceed 200 million pounds with a total annual output more than double this amount of cured tea. But above any other factor, and perhaps greater than all of them combined in contributing to the high maintenance efficiency attained in these countries, must be placed the standard of living to which the industrial classes have been compelled to adjust themselves, combined with the most rigorous economy which they practice along every line of effort and of living. Almost every foot of land is made to contribute material for food, fuel or fabric. Everything which can be made edible serves as food for man or domestic animals. Whatever cannot be eaten or worn is used for fuel. The wastes of the body, of fuel and of fabric are taken back to the field. Before doing so they are housed against waste from weather, intelligently compounded and patiently worked at through 1, 3 or even 6 months, in order to bring them into the most efficient form to serve as manure for the soil, or as feed for the crop. It seems to be a golden rule with these industrious people, or if not golden, then an inviolable one, that whenever an extra hour or day of labor can promise even a little larger return, it must be given, and nothing be permitted to cancel the obligation or defer its execution.